Please.
Good singing. Appreciate it. A good preacher can never overcome bad singing. And bad preaching can be enhanced by good singing. So we're glad that you sang and sang well. John and Rachel are right there. John Hackett Jr. Well, it's not really a junior, but John Hackett is here. He preaches up in Gulf Shores. And some of you may remember years ago, John and Rachel tried out here for the youth minister's job. It's when Tony got it. And, you'll remember him or recognize him from there. But his dad, John Hackett Sr., not really senior, but was a minister in, several places in Alabama and in Anderson, Indiana, too. He's one of my great friends. He died a couple of years ago. You might remember him. And I preached with him in Troy. And so I've known John since he was a little kid. I mean, a little boy. His dad would come through. He'd always call and stop by the house, spend a couple of days whenever he was traveling around and on trips, and he always had one of his kids with him. And John was one of them. So I watched John grow up, and Rachel was a student at Troy State, back when it was Troy State. And she was in the student center, and John and Rachel met, I think, in my living room, or at least they dated in my living room when they very first began to date. Don't let her throw a softball to you. She will burn you on softball. I'm telling you, she will burn. I can remember stories, but we better go ahead. We're studying the book of Ruth today, and that's not a normal pick for me. It's in the story. It's in chapter 10, and it's not. I mean, it's got a couple of good lessons in it that preachers preach, but really there's just two of those, and I really wondered why it's in the story. The story is we're all reading the story. If you need a book, incidentally, if you'll see me or John or one of the elders or somebody, will get you a book. I mean, it's free of charge. We'd like for you to have a book. But that goes through the upper story of God and the lower story of our lives or of man, and he's weaving together the story from the Genesis chapter 1 all the way through Revelation, and they're important texts. And I wondered why it's in this text, why Ruth made the cut, and so many stories didn't make the cut. I mean, so many stories that I know and that we know and that are so prolific and so abounding are not in the story. But Ruth is in there. Ruth was written during the time of the judges, but it's not written by a judge. And it's really not a prominent story about God, really. I mean, he's in there, but not prominently. It's a love story. And you have to wonder why Ruth is in the story. And hopefully we'll discover that today. It's about Elimelech. Elimelech was her husband. Naomi was the mother. They had two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And they had, each of the sons married Moabite women. Moabites they were opposed to Israel almost all the time. They were Gentiles. They were not at war during this time period, but they married Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah, not Oprah. So you didn't hear me preach about Oprah today. Oprah is not in the Bible. Orpah was from Moab. Moab was, like I said, they were descendants of Sodom, if that tells you anything. And it was a godless nation. So why Ruth? Well, Benjamin Franklin was an ambassador before he was a president, and he was an ambassador in France. And he often went to what they called the Infidels Club. And they were known to read literature and other things like that, and they would comment on the literature, and they were very prolific. I mean, they were kind of uppity too, So they were all into literature. And on one occasion, he read from the book of Ruth to the club. But he changed all the names, so they didn't know it was from the Bible. And when he finished, they were unanimously praising him and praising the reading. It's only 4 chapters, so it didn't take very long. And they said it was one of the most beautiful short stories they'd ever heard, and demanded that he tell them where he had run across such a remarkable work of art that they'd never heard of. And he delighted a lot in telling them that it was from the Bible. So that really is the nature of the story. It's just a great story. And we're going to dig in it to find what relevance, what truth there is for us today. The first thing I want you to notice, it's a story of love. All the characters in here loved one another a great deal. Elimelech particularly. Ruth 1, starting in verse number 1, says, "In the days when judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man from Bethlehem of Judea, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name Naomi. The names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to Moab and lived there." So, Naomi loved her husband loved Naomi, loved the 2 kids. But there's a famine. And Elimelech wanted to take care of the family. He wanted to produce income and so forth. So they decided to make the move to Moab. I can imagine Naomi thinking to herself, or maybe even saying, I don't really want to go to Moab. That's away from friends. It's away from family. It's away from everything she knew. But they had the 2 sons, and she knew they needed to feed them and knew they needed to have food for themselves and other things. She didn't know a soul in Moab. So she's leaving her homeland, moving to another country. And so she's willing to go. I'm just assuming all that. As long as they're together. As long as she and Elimelech are together, it's going to be all right. I related to Paige when I read this. Because we used to always say, are we okay? We'd be having spat or whatever, and she'd say, are we okay? Because if we're okay, everything's okay. And sometimes I would say it to her. That's just a standard phrase. And that's the way we feel. When we move down here, we're doing the Lord's work, doing God's work. We're pleased to come, but we also moved away to a foreign country. We lived in Florida now. And I'm from Alabama. She's from Alabama. But all of our family's up in Alabama. And our 2 little kids, all their families in Alabama too. And it's really kind of like Naomi and Elimelech leaving Judah and moving to Moab. But as long as we're okay, everything's okay. And so you can see this kind of love relationship with Naomi and Elimelech, her husband. But then strange things happened. Elimelech died. It doesn't tell us how or why. It doesn't tell us if he got sick or, it was a lengthy illness or if he died in an accident. But it just informs us that he died. So there's Naomi with her 2 sons, and, they lived there for, several years, and they were married. Well, after about 10 years, the sons die. This doesn't sound too much like a love story, does it? It doesn't sound very pleasant. And it wasn't pleasant for Naomi. And that was all produced because of love. Naomi's got a big heart. Elimelech had a big heart too. So do their sons and the sons' wives. They're doing everything that they can do right. So it doesn't seem fair that Naomi will lose her husband. It doesn't seem fair that she would lose her first son. And it doesn't seem fair that she would lose her second son. So there's Naomi. She's living in Moab. And she's alone, aside from the friends that she's met. So it's a story of love, but it's also the story of loss. Story of loss, big loss, not little loss. They'd already lost their income in Judah, a famine. And I'm assuming that Elimelech was a farmer or whatever, and there was just no rain, no produce to shear. And Naomi seemingly lost everything. Everything. Well, you think about your life, and I think about mine. And we would normally think that God's going to take care of me. Life's going to be okay. Imagine if Elimelech was sick, Naomi prayed for him. Imagine if her sons were sick, they prayed for her sons. But she kept getting bad news and bad news and bad news. And it was a story of great loss. In fact, down in verse 20 in chapter 1, she got back to Judah, and they said, "Is that Naomi?" They didn't recognize her right away. But she said this, "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter." Now, Naomi means the sweet one. Mara means the bitter one. So her life had gone from being sweet to being bitter. From being full and satisfied to being empty and lost. Some of life's best people are often struck down, or their businesses go down, or their home burns, or they lose a loved one, let alone 3. But that's all right, because Romans 8:28 is still in the Bible. It's still in the book. It says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who loved him and who have been called according to his purpose." And so, yes, this is a story of love, but it's also a story of loss. Some of you can relate to the loss. Some of you have had husbands and wives who have left you, left the children, maybe left the Lord. And you know what that feels like, to feel abandoned. Or you know when the job goes south. You know what it feels like to need things. You can't pay the bills. So you have to move out of your house and into an apartment or something like that. I feel that struggle for Naomi. And maybe a lot of you feel that story too. But it's also the story of loyalty. I mean, it's strong on loyalty. Ruth chapter 1 verse 8 says, "Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, 'Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you, as you have shown your dead and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband.' Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud, and said to her, 'We'll go back with you to your people.' But Naomi said, 'Return home, my daughters.'" Well, we know that they're not her daughters. They're her daughters-in-law, but she's treating them like family. They are family. Naomi is a love story. And she is expressing her love to them. And they pack up and get everything ready to move back to Judah. And they start on the trip, and that's when she stops. She says, "Look, you go home. You're from here. All your relatives are here. All your friends are from here. And why do you want to go back with me? I'm an old woman. What, am I going to have some sons for them to grow up and you to marry? That's not going to work. So you need to stay here where you are familiar with things. Well, that showed a lot of love right there. And Orpah decided to go back. And they hugged and kissed, and then Orpah went. But Ruth said, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you'll go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I'll be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her to go. Now that passage it may be the only passage you know out of this whole book of Ruth. It's quoted a lot in weddings. That's where I've heard it, and it's where I've used it a lot. But it's from a daughter-in-law talking to her mother-in-law. And it expresses such loyalty that I can't really even imagine. Here, Ruth is willing to leave friends and family and all her surroundings that she's familiar with and go to Judah, a place she's only heard about, with Naomi. And if that doesn't show loyalty, I will never know. But then there's also a story of legacy. And this is where we're brought into the story. This is where it's important for us and important for the story to use the book of Ruth. That's where we meet Boaz. We don't know a lot about Boaz, but we know enough for the story to make sense. He was a distant relative of Naomi. He was kind of a wealthy landowner, and he was a good man. He owned fields, and his workers were out in the fields working. And Ruth, was a foreigner, but she was willing to glean from the fields. And do you know what gleaning is? That's when they would pick the corners or around the edges of the field after the harvesters had gone through. And harvesters rarely get everything in the field. You can see, Cleve and I drove through Alabama and Georgia and up to Tennessee this past week, and there were cotton fields. And some of the cotton fields had big round bales of cotton out beside the fields. But you can look across the fields that they had picked, and it's just white. It's got cotton on the stalks because the harvesters don't get everything. Well, the gleaners, it was approved or allowed in the Old Testament to go back after the harvesting was done and to collect what they could collect. And the gleaners were people who needed the food, needed the money from whatever they gleaned. That's what Ruth is doing. So she goes to Boaz's fields, and she's harvesting barley. And she notices Boaz, and Boaz noticed her too. And they kind of have a connection, but it's an unspoken connection. But as they get to know each other, and as she continues to glean, she's got a good reputation from the harvesters. But he encourages her to stay in his fields and only glean from him. And then he warns all his employees, not to touch her, but to look after her. And in fact, you take some grain when you see she's around and out of the bags and put it down for her. So he's making her job easier all the time. And he tells her she can get a drink from the water that his men had stored in jars. Well, the other gleaners would have to come up with their own food and drink. But here is a foreigner being treated this way. And he tells her to stay until the barley and the wheat harvest were done. Well, I didn't know this except that I read. The barley gets ripe before the wheat does. And so the barley harvest is going on. And then after that, the wheat harvest is going on. So it may be, it's a page in the Bible, but it may be, a month, maybe 2 months or 3 months that she is there harvesting grain. She goes back and she talks to Naomi. Naomi tells her that she needs to take a bath. I'm sure that's a good advice for everybody. You need to take a bath and put on your best clothes. And when Boaz is sleeping, to lie down and uncover his feet. So she slips in. It's at midnight. And she finds Boaz asleep on the threshing floor, away from the other workers. And she uncovers his feet and she lays down beside him. Well, something startled him. I don't know if it was her or some event. But then he wakes up to find her at his feet. He says, "Who is it?" Now, you would think that's kind of strange. Coming from, he's a wealthy landowner. But there's no lights out. It's pitch black. So he says, "Who is it?" And she reveals herself as Ruth. And then he tells her to lie down. She can stay that night. He covers her with the corner of his garment. And then she leaves the next morning before they get up. And before we, our minds start characterizing that event as something in sexual connotation, nothing sexual happens at all. But she wants to leave before the other people wake up around and see her, before Boaz has a chance to make arrangements or whatever he wants to do. So she goes ahead and leaves. Well, Boaz was what the Bible calls a kinsman redeemer. A kinsman redeemer. What is that? Goel is the original word for where we say kinsman. He's a Goel redeemer. And that means that in Israel, if he's related to someone that dies, he has a right to buy their property. Israel was big on property, and everybody got an inheritance that was property. Well, Naomi, had her husband to die, and her 2 sons that would be the inheritance to die. So Naomi's property was, out the window if she dies. So he is called a kinsman redeemer because he can buy the property and keep it in the family name. Well, he says to Ruth, "You don't worry about anything, and I'll handle everything because everybody in town knows that you are a woman of noble character." Noble character. Well, then in chapter 4, verse 9, it says this. "Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, 'Today you're witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I've also acquired Ruth, the Moabitess, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from the town records. Today you're witnesses.'" So he goes to the city gate. He takes 10 elders. They see another kinsman redeemer, and actually he was the guy that he saw was in first place, and he was in second place. And he made the arrangement known to the other kinsman redeemer. "We don't have his name." And he said, I don't want it. You have the property and all the women and whatever. So that was what Boaz was waiting to hear and wanting to hear. And so the witnesses were there to seal the deal. They passed sandals and other things. That was part of their custom of the day. Then chapter 4, verse 13 says, "So Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. And then he went to her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The woman said to Naomi, 'Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer.'" Now remember, we're talking about the legacy. "May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth. Then Naomi took the child, laid him in her lap, and cared for him. The women living there said, Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. That's King David. This then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Abinadab, Abinadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, Boaz the father of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse, Jesse the father of David. We will have a test on these names. You won't get into heaven unless you can read them. Did you understand what happened? Through Boaz and Ruth, they had a son who became in the lineage of Jesus Christ. I didn't realize that Ruth was a Moabitess. I should have known, but I didn't know that. She's a Gentile. And she is in Matthew in the lineage of David. You know that Jesus was called the Lion of David, Lion of Judah, the son of David. So the legacy that Boaz had with Ruth is their offspring, who was the 28th grandfather, if you don't, it's 28 generations between him and Jesus. That's amazing. It's an amazing story. And it took love to get to that point. And it even took loss to get to that point. It took loyalty to get to that point. And it may take the same thing for us. It may take the same thing for us. You know about love. You know how important love is, and you know about loyalty. You may not really equate loss with being something that's in God's plan or that God can use. But he can. He doesn't answer all prayers, yes. And despite all the people that preach the health and wealth doctrines of today, that's not true in the Bible. It's just not true. I do believe that God will bless you. It doesn't mean that nobody will die. It doesn't mean that you won't get sick. It doesn't mean that your business will always do well, that you'll do well financially. It does mean if you're loyal, if you hang on to God, he can turn everything around. And how blessed we are to have the book of Ruth to express that blessing in such a phenomenal way. Do you agree? This book ties together the upper story of God with the lower story of Ruth. As tragic as it is, it has a happy ending. As tragic as our lives may be, they also can have happy endings. No matter what life has thrown at you, if you'll maintain love, if you'll maintain loyalty, even suffering loss, you too can be a part of the legacy of that story when Jesus comes and returns. So where are you in life? Maybe you're suffering loss right now. Maybe you can't see the end of the road and you don't know how it's going to turn out. Neither could Ruth. But the message for today is to hang on to God. And it'll all turn out all right. If you have something you need to share, would you please share it as we stand and sing?